So before we get started, who was here for the Vue conference? OK, I don't think I've seen any other hand other than the Vue. So that is good. Otherwise, you would see a couple redundant slides. So the Angular language server. Who is excited to talk about language servers? OK, that's not too bad. So language servers. Before we talk about the Angular language server in particular, let's take like 20, 30 steps back. Who here is familiar with language server protocols as a concept? That is more than I expected. OK, so to give you like a brief overview, language servers are we commonly refer to language server and language server protocol and language services very often as the very same thing, even though they're slightly different. So language server protocol is established by Microsoft mostly to power VS Code, but we don't talk about that. So it's a specification that allows you to provide IDE-like features in the code editor. Right? So very easily said, you have the protocol, and then over standard in, standard out, you communicate with the IDE, hey, I need to autocomplete this thing here, right? And then, so it's very UI-driven in the way, like for autocomplete and those kind of things. And it kind of feels like this if we take into consideration like all the IDEs out there, if we talk about NeoVim, Sublime, Atom, JetBrains IDEs, all those things implement LSPs to some extent if it matches their user interaction and all those things. So while an LSP has a certain specification, the language itself needs to implement those features, and then it needs also to be supported by your editor of choice. So there can be, to some extent, a mismatch. And for Angular, this looks kind of like this, very easily said. So you have the client. In your case, it might be the VS Code plugin that you install. And this VS Code plugin bundles the Angular language server. That is a binary that you start once you are in an Angular component. And this language server then is a TypeScript host. TypeScript host, I didn't know that either, is basically an abstraction that is used within the TypeScript compiler to abstract the file system. And after that, you're using the Angular language service, which is fundamentally different from language server. And that is, you usually see that in your node modules to some extent, that is, provides the language features for Angular. So language server, binary that you start, language service provides language features. Very, very important. I will probably mess this up during this talk because the differentiation is kind of very nuanced. But again, language server is the binary, language service is the language features. So for Angular, we need to talk TypeScript, we need to talk HTML, we need to talk CSS, and all those features are provided by the language service and used by the language server to provide to the IDE. And the message format for LSPs is this like fancy JSON structure. Right? So you have some like JSON RPC, which is like unnecessary metadata. We don't talk about that. You have an ID so that you can cancel open requests, for instance, and those kind of things. And we have a method, right? Text document completion is the very common one, right? You put like you have a JSON, you say like JSON dot, and then you expect like the keys to pop up. And you also share the file where you want the completion so that the language server can open it, read it, check if there are any surrounding code that might be relevant. And the very important thing is that language servers, usually most of the requests work by the position of your cursor. So yeah, it doesn't care about anything around it very much. And the response looks kind of like this. So you might have something like the idea again, in case you want to discard a response or it's already outdated or something like that. And you get the results that then is shown in a pop-up or something, and you can navigate through it. And so a little backstory, actually. I named this talk Angular Language Server Inside Out. And I submitted this talk before I actually knew a whole lot about the Angular Language Server. Oops. But this is pretty much the most interesting part of the language server, because I think in total, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like maybe 150 lines of code. So we could spend the whole 30 minutes to go through every line by line. But this is the important thing. This is the abstraction where we say, those are all the features that the language server support, and then we pretty much just redirect it to the language service, which is a nice thing, because this way you can install any language service, like node module, and still work with any language server plugin in VS Code. The thing you might have noticed now, if you look very closely, I didn't, but if you look very closely, you would have noticed that here, there's nothing like on request semantic highlighting or something. One of the most misconceptions is, and people approach me very often with that, particularly now with the let syntax in Angular, we're like, well, Jan-Niklas, if you would use the language server, we would at least get like syntax highlighting. Nope. The thing is, syntax highlighting in IDEs very, very rarely use language servers. And particularly in VS Code, it kind of looks like that you use TextMate, which is a standard that is fairly old, but it's pretty much a fancy regex. You can go in the Angular tooling repository and see that. There are a couple JSON files that define, oh, if you're like in the style block of the Angular component, that is CSS, by the way, so please highlight that accordingly. So talking about the Angular language server wouldn't be a really interesting talk. Sorry. So if you had high hopes for this, I'm kind of sorry. Let's rather talk about the Angular language service, because that's interesting. And before I keep talking, my name is Jan-Niklas Wortmann. Dave already announced it. I'm developer advocate for JetBrains. I'm Angular NGDE, RxJS core team. I do have opinions on signals, in case you're not aware. And I'm also host on the Angular Plus show, where I mostly rant about enums. So back to this slide. And this is a little bit overly simplified, because if we look at the Angular language service, at the node module, in case you've not done it, this might be a week old, so if this has been updated, if there's a fancy README now, cool. But the Angular language service provides features for your Angular components, right? Our Angular components look something like that. We have some kind of TypeScript code. We have some kind of HTML that is more like TypeScript-ish, because we expect things like type checking. We expect things like implicit this context. Those kind of things are, we expect them from this file. So what we need to support this is the Angular compiler that is used by the Angular language service and the TCB. Anyone, any idea what TCB is? Sweet. TCB stands for type check block. And honestly, that's the most interesting part of the Angular language service, because it also fundamentally works different in other languages like Vue or something. So when you open an Angular component, can you read this? It looks pretty tiny. Well, let me go through it for you. So if you open a TypeScript file in VS Code, what happens is that you create a TypeScript project. You might have done that if you worked with Angular schematics, for instance. You're creating a TypeScript project. And creating a TypeScript project, even though an LSP is usually just for one particular file, it creates the whole AST for the entire project. And then, based on the file that you open, it resolves the AST abstract syntax tree, right? So like basically a machine-readable way for source code. And in that AST, it will notice, oh, in the decorator, there might be a template. You might need to resolve that if you use like an actual HTML file, but that doesn't matter. And the TCB then converts that HTML code to TypeScript code. And basically fakes or provides you IntelliSense on that. We will take a closer look at that too. And with that TCB, it generates an ngtypecheck.ts file. And that gets added to the TypeScript program as a virtual file so that you get IntelliSense in your IDE. For instance, if you use an Angular component and you would do event binding and that component doesn't have that output declared, you will get an error in VS Code. And this TCB pipe is, or this TCB part is fairly complex if we take a couple, or think about this a little bit more, because Angular is a fairly dynamic language, right? Within the HTML part, we might have an Angular component that might be in a different module. And this different module might be in a different, you might have a different TS config for that. So you might need to declare a new TypeScript project, and the whole shebang goes over and over again. And if you, in VS Code, for instance, do the debugging part for the Angular language service, you will notice something like this, where you have title component, or like a component, and then later on, the same component with .ngtypecheck. You won't notice this ngtypecheck file in your source code. It doesn't exist. It's just a virtual file that gets created to provide IntelliSense for the HTML part. And I think this is kind of funny, because we're telling VS Code, oh, this HTML part that you have, that is absolutely not type safe. Let's do this in TypeScript instead, so that we can fake the positions of the error in the TypeScript part to the HTML part. And this kind of looks like this. Let me do something fancy. So let me zoom a couple times. Right, so we have an Angular component here. Fairly straightforward. I have a couple of click listeners, not something particularly interesting. If we now want to look at how this type-check file looks like, TCB, we get something like this. And down here is the interesting part. Down here, you now notice, oh, it's basically just calling create element for my HTML elements. It's registering the event listener, how you would do it like 10 years ago in like basic JavaScript or jQuery, kind of. And with those things in mind, it totally makes sense how you, for instance, now get IntelliSense over something that doesn't really have IntelliSense because it's inside the HTML. And the thing that I think is particularly interesting is because we as Angular developers are used to this aspect that we can just say, oh, counter machine, even though counter machine within the TypeScript component, you would usually have to say like this dot counter machine. In the HTML part, we just assume, oh yeah, this is the way that Angular works. But conceptually, it doesn't make sense because the language doesn't work like that. So what you need to do here is fake this aspect. So this dot counter machine is implicitly not this counter machine. Make sense? Makes sense. And we can talk about like a couple examples how they're done, how the TCB part, or how the template refers or matches to the TCB part. There are like nuances if we talk about control flow syntax versus structural directives and those kind of things. The other thing that I personally think is very interesting, you might know that OK, that's fine. So you might know the fact that when you use the optional chaining, usually in TypeScript, what optional chaining does is it creates a new type that is either like your type or undefined. Because of some history with Angular, Dart, and those kind of things for who are the people who are still around, or who were around at that time, in Angular, in the TCB part, it's considered undefined, even though it's actually null at runtime, but small nuances. So this also allows Angular to fake the template to some extent. Make sense? Cool. All right. I got a couple summary slides here, how this is done, just if you want to go through them. But the interesting part here is really, that was like eye-opening for me, is that it uses just add event listener under the hood, so that you can, to some extent, get an IntelliSense of what are valid events, what is a valid argument that I can pass to that, those kind of things. And also that it's just using template literal strings for string interpolation. And I also have this example here for a type mismatch, how that is handled. Because at the end of the day, we're just calling the same function in the, as you see here. So if you define your function with a number, but you're calling it actually with a string, this way TypeScript can tell you, oh, OK, I have an error here, and matches that to the HTML part. I stand a little bit corrected, because there was one interesting part that I noticed in the Angular language server, which is pretty much this code. Does anyone have an idea what this code does? The thing with language servers is, particularly in the TypeScript ecosystem, they allow a thing called plugins. And Vue, for instance, works like that. If you're using Volar and Vue, it just generates or uses a TypeScript language server plugin to say, oh, if you have a .vue file, this is how you handle this. The Angular language server now, what it does, if it notices a plugin that is not the Angular language server, it throws an error. We're not judging this. The thing is, it basically makes the work for meta frameworks like Analog a little difficult. So as things are right now, the Angular language server does not support plugins in any way. I hope this is subject to discuss. So I think roughly a year ago, I started working at JetBrains as a developer advocate. And probably even before I started working on there, people approached me and were like, well, Jan-Niklas, why is WebStorm not using the Angular language server? Which is a valid question. The thing is, there's history. And we used to use the Angular language server. There were stability issues and things like that we decided at some point that this is not the user experience that we want to offer. Instead, we decided to basically build our own system. The thing for people that might have seen Erica's talk from VietConf last week from the Astro team, she kind of stole my thunder here. The thing is, we're working right now on using the TypeScript language server instead of our own TypeScript engine. And with that work, we also decided to use parts of the Angular language server. And with parts of the Angular language server, I particularly refer to the TCB part. We, for various reasons, decided to rewrite it in Kotlin for our own purposes instead of directly using it. But this allows us to do something like this. So if you're now using an Angular component in WebStorm, what it does is it looks for the TypeScript part and the HTML part. The CSS part is not really relevant for this. For the TypeScript part, it just throws this at the TypeScript language server. You get IntelliSense, easy fucking peasy. For the HTML part, we throw this into our own TCB engine, which is pretty much copy-pasted from Angular into Kotlin. And from there on, we throw that at Volar. Volar is a name. Anyone idea what Volar is? Not too many? Cool. So Volar is a framework written by the Vue community to develop language servers. Pretty cool thing, and it has great integration for TypeScript, Vue, Astro, MDX, those kind of things. Svelte is working on a plugin. So pretty cool thing. So what our TCB engine now does is we internally have a Volar plugin that we register in the TypeScript language server that can handle the TCB file, the file that I literally just showed you in WebStorm, right? And with that, we get types. The other thing we also use is our web store, or like our index. So anytime you're working with TypeScript files and those kind of things, we update our index that we know, oh, this type is coming from there and those kind of things. We need that because you have modules. Or you might have different components that you use in your TypeScript file, in your HTML part. So this allows us to not traverse the whole TypeScript project again to figure out where a module, where a component is coming from, but rather rely on our caching mechanism that is already in place. And once we throw that at Volar, we have types. So this whole thing is still very actively under development. I hope. So I think this migration project for the TypeScript language server started like last year. I hope we get it done with the next major release, but that's still TBD. The thing that I would recommend you, if you're a user, and that would help us heavily, is if you go in the settings, if you go to TypeScript, if you select use types from server here, and in Angular, select auto here. This will use that same engine and will help us make sure that our integration works the way we expect it to work. Appreciate it. All right, I was way faster than I thought I was. Are there questions? No, just kidding. So the thing I want to summarize is that LSPs, the thing that I want you to take out of this, is LSPs are really cool to provide baseline features in an IDE. It's a standard that, it's a standardized protocol. So integrating it is nice and seamlessly and provides decent amount of features. It does have several limitations, particularly due to the fact that it's just based on one file. And there are also, the protocol is lacking some features that you might expect. For instance, debugging support, test runners, those kind of things that are usually part of a holistic development experience can just not be expressed as an LSP. The idea of how the template checking is done is really, really cool, because it reuses a lot of the parts that are already done in the Angular compiler that you need for just compiling Angular applications and makes it available in a common format to your IDE. So that's a very cool idea, and I'm glad the Angular team did that. And lastly, I'm just a very big fan of everything that Volar did for the community, so I just want to give those guys a shout out here. It's a great product. Well, it's not even a product, it's just open source. It's great. They did fantastic work for the community, not just for Vue, but also now for Angular, Svelte, MDX, etc., etc. Thank you very much. That's all I got.